Savath 9 felt a chill run down his spine. "You waited for us to figure out the trap," he whispered. "You did," Chen acknowledged with a slight, respectful nod toward Savath 9. Eventually, Orthmaz reached for the data chip with a hand that was visibly shaking. As his eyes tracked the red invasion vectors of the Dravari battle fleet, his composure shattered completely. "They've crossed the outer Keth boundary," he breathed. "A fleet of this scale, the Conclave border garrisons will be swept aside in less than 12 hours. The resolution: we must immediately convene an emergency session of the High Council to suspend Resolution 7 Theta." "You don't need to suspend anything," Chen said calmly. "Humanity is still in complete compliance with Conclave law." Orthmaz blinked, bewildered. "What?" "Those 412 vessels operating in the Kepler corridor are registered civilian freighters," Chen explained, the small, tired smile returning to her face. "Their crews are contracted technical personnel, and the 2,000 warships sitting in your lower docking bays are technically Conclave property under maintenance." She stood up, leaning her hands lightly against the edge of the table. "If the Secretary General were to issue an emergency logistics authorization, requesting that private Terran shipping companies assist in a high-priority border crisis, I imagine it is entirely within your legal authority to grant it." The full magnitude of the trap finally landed on everyone in the room. It wasn't just a physical counterstrike, it was a masterclass in legal and strategic architecture. "You built this," Savath 9 said, his voice filled not with accusation but with pure, unadulterated awe. "From the very moment the disarmament resolution was drafted, you constructed the legal compliance framework so that it could be reversed in minutes without violating a single galactic clause." "We built the compliance structure," Chen corrected gently, "so that when this moment arrived, the Conclave would have options it didn't know it possessed." "For our benefit?" Orthmaz asked, a complex mix of shame and relief in his voice. "For everyone's benefit," Chen said. "Humanity has colonies near the Keth border too. We aren't interested in watching the galaxy burn just to prove a point." She checked her wrist comm, then looked up at Orthmaz. "I will need your emergency logistics authorization within the next 30 minutes for our prepositioning to matter. The fuel reserves won't stay warm forever." Chen turned and began walking toward the heavy blast doors of the chamber. She paused at the threshold, her hand resting on the frame, though she did not look back. "For what it's worth, Secretary General," she said quietly into the massive room, "we never wanted a fight with the Conclave. We just wanted you to see us clearly enough to stop being afraid of us." She paused for a beat. "We're still waiting for that part." The blast doors slid shut with a heavy hydraulic thud, leaving 17 species sitting in a room built to represent 4,000 years of supreme galactic governance, staring at a data chip left by a woman who had turned an empire's surrender into the ultimate trap. The 30 minutes passed in a blur of hyper-compressed bureaucracy. Orthmaz signed the emergency logistics authorization with a hand that barely held the digital stylus steady. Within seconds, the order bypassed the usual weeks of committee debates, flashing straight to the Conclave station's central control grid. High above the planet, deep inside the station's massive holding bays, the quiet routine of 4,000 years vanished in an instant. Savath 9 stood in the high observation gallery, watching through the massive reinforced viewport. Below him, 2,412 Terran warships, ships that the Conclave had spent over a year cataloging, locking down, and celebrating as monuments to human defeat, woke up. It wasn't a slow, staggered boot sequence, it was a simultaneous terrifying roar of industrial power. The diagnostics that Admiral Chen's teams had run for weeks hadn't just been maintenance, they were a pre-ignition sequence. Antimatter drive cores flared to life in unison, their blue-white ignition halos lighting up the cavernous dark of the docking bays. Magnetic clamps disengaged with a deafening metallic screech. "Look at the registry feeds," Preth whispered beside him, his voice trembling as he monitored his handheld pad. "The 412 civilian freighters in the Kepler corridor. They've dropped their cargo pods, Savath." Savath 9 didn't need to look at the screen to know what was happening. In deep space, the reclassified heavy destroyers were already rendezvousing with hidden logistical tenders launched from the Kuiper Belt asteroid armories. Mechanical gantry arms, pre-staged in the dark corners of the Sol system 18 months ago, were mounting heavy kinetic rail cannons and long-range torpedo racks back onto the clean hull mountings. It was a modular rearmament process so precise it looked like an automated assembly line. Within 40 minutes of the Secretary General's signature, 412 war-ready destroyers had reformed into tight combat wedges, jumping into warp toward the Keth border. Simultaneously, from the Conclave central docks, 2,000 fully fueled Terran warships surged outward into the void, forming a vast, overlapping perimeter around the station before locking onto the exact same warp coordinates. "They didn't just hide a fleet," Savath 9 murmured, watching the blue warp trails streak across the dark space outside the window. They pre-positioned an entire war effort inside our own administrative house. 300 light-years away, at the edge of the Keth border sector, the Dravari Vanguard fleet drifted in heavy attack formation. Comprising over 1,500 armored dreadnoughts and planetary assault carriers, the Dravari invasion force had advanced under the absolute conviction that the sector was a wide-open target. Their diplomatic intelligence had assured them that Resolution 7 Theta had neutered the Terran Union, leaving the region's defense completely reliant on a handful of underfunded Conclave border patrols. The Dravari High Commander sat on the bridge of his flagship, preparing to broadcast the final order to cross the border and seize the strategic mineral worlds of the Keth system. Then space tore open. It didn't happen in standard orderly warp waves. The sensors on the Dravari flagship screamed in warning as 2,800 warship signatures dropped out of subspace simultaneously. They didn't arrive in defensive hold patterns. They materialized directly across the Dravari's primary vector of attack, forming an impenetrable wall of tungsten armor, active targeting sensors, and primed plasma batteries. On the Dravari bridge, the tactical holos display turned blood red. "Adent signatures," the Dravari tactical officer yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "Commander, the fleet blocking our transit vector." "That is impossible," the commander roared, slamming his fist onto his console. "The Conclave stripped their fleet 14 months ago. The human navy doesn't exist. Look at the sensor logs," the officer screamed back. 2,000 heavy combatants in frontline formation. Another 400 heavy destroyers locking railgun arrays onto our flagship right now. Their reactors are running at maximum combat output. For 3 agonizing minutes, 2 massive fleets hovered in the absolute stillness of deep space, separated by less than 50,000 kilometers of void. The Dravari were rational actors. Their entire invasion strategy had been calculated on a simple mathematical premise, striking a helpless disarmed sector to force a quick concession from a hesitant conclave. They had calculated the cost of fighting the conclave's weak garrisons. They had not calculated the cost of slamming headfirst into the full, undivided strength of the Terran Combined Arms fleet, rearmed, fully fueled, and operating under a legal mandate handed to them by the conclave itself. The Dravari tactical computers ran the engagement simulations. The outcome was clear: total catastrophic annihilation of the Vanguard within 40 minutes of engagement. Slowly, methodically, the Dravari flagship powered down its offensive weapons arrays. Tactical thrusters fired, and the 1,500 Dravari warships began a slow, deliberate retreat back into their own territory. Not a single plasma bolt was fired. Not a single missile left its tube. The greatest invasion of the century had been broken in less than 5 minutes, not through bloodshed, but through the sheer, terrifying weight of a fleet that wasn't supposed to exist. Back on the Conclave station, the silence in the observation gallery felt entirely different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of an unseen trap, but the stunned quiet of an empire coming to terms with its own blinding ignorance. Savath 9's comms console chimed with a priority signal. It was Preth. "Savath, the Dravari fleet is holding position," Preth reported, his voice filled with an almost surreal sense of disbelief. "They've received the transit signatures of the Terran vessels. They're withdrawing, sir. Pulling back beyond the border markers. Slow and orderly, but they are retreating." Savath 9 looked out at the empty docking bays where the human fleet had sat for over a year. "No shots fired, no shots fired," Preth confirmed. "Because of course not," Savath 9 said quietly to himself. The Dravari were rational actors. They had moved against a region they believed was undefended. A region they had been led to believe was permanently stripped of its teeth. Confronted with a wall of 2,800 war-ready human combatants that shouldn't legally or physically have been there, the Dravari ran the numbers, accepted the mathematical reality of total destruction, and recalculated. Savath 9 pulled up a file on his terminal, a document he had opened and reread a dozen times over the past week while trying to solve the riddle of human compliance. It was the original Key Institute Threat Assessment on Humanity, written 40 years ago when Earth first made contact with the galactic community. The primary analyst who wrote it had long since retired, but his final recommendation on the last page had been preserved in the archives. Humanity's primary threat characteristic is not their technological advancement, nor their raw military capacity. It is their demonstrated willingness to accept enormous individual and collective cost in service of long-term strategic objectives that are not immediately legible to outside observers. Recommend treating any human compliance or concession as potentially instrumental until the underlying objective is identified. 40 years ago, the Conclave's High Council had skimmed that finding, stamped it under secondary strategic notes, and filed it away in favor of easier, more comforting assumptions. They had assumed that compliance meant surrender, because surrender was what compliance meant to every other species they had governed for 4 millennia. Savath 9 read the paragraph twice more, then closed the file. The humans had not hidden their fleet merely to protect themselves from the Conclave. They had hidden it to protect the entire galactic structure from a threat the Conclave had failed to see coming, all while meticulously maintaining the delicate diplomatic architecture required to keep the galaxy functioning. They had accepted the public humiliating spectacle of symbolic defeat. Admiral Chen had walked into that grand chamber, placed her ceremonial sidearm on the plinth, and endured the quiet condescension of 17 species. She had done it because the alternative was an open military confrontation with the Conclave that would have fractured the galaxy right on the eve of a Dreveri invasion. They had tolerated the Conclave's fear. They had worked around it, maneuvered through its legal loopholes, and quietly protected the very people who were trying to neuter them. Savath 9's terminal chimed again. A high-ranking Conclave security official appeared on the display. "The Secretary General wants a full, comprehensive debrief," the official demanded briskly. "Everything you know about how they executed this operation, analyst." "Everything I know," Savath 9 replied steadily, "is still not enough." "What do you mean?" "I know the mechanism," Savath 9 said, watching the last faint warp trails fade outside the viewport. "I don't know the decision." "What decision?" "The decision to accept the risk," Savath 9 explained softly. "They surrendered their fleet formally and sat exposed for over a year on the off chance that we would ask the right question at the right moment. If the Dreveri had struck sooner, or if we had refused to listen to Admiral Chen today, the humans would have been forced to deploy a rogue fleet without Conclave authorization, permanently destroying our alliance structure. They took that catastrophic gamble for us, while we spent 14 months celebrating our victory over them." The official on the screen remained silent for a long moment. "Should I inform the Secretary General of that interpretation?" "Tell him exactly that," Savath 9 said. "And tell him to pull the 40-year-old threat assessment out of the secondary archives." He terminated the call and walked out of his office into the station's main promenade. The corridor was quiet. He passed a small group of Terran diplomatic staff, walking in the opposite direction. They were civilians, officially, unarmed, dressed in modest blue uniforms. As they passed, one of the human aides caught Savath 9's eye. The human didn't offer a grand salute or a boastful smile. He simply gave a slight solemn nod, the subtle gesture humans used when recognizing someone who had finally truly understood. Savath 9 nodded back. As he walked toward the executive level, Savath 9 thought about the deep dark between the asteroids in the outer Sol belt. He thought about the silent salvage yards that weren't salvage yards, holding heavy railguns in the cold void, waiting patiently for a call that everyone hoped would never come. Humanity hadn't survived their brutal history by being the strongest or the loudest species in the dark. They had survived because across millions of years of evolution, they had mastered the one art the ancient empires had forgotten. The ones who survive are never the ones who beat their chests early. They are the ones who are still standing calm and prepared when everyone else finally realizes the game has changed. But happiness has a way of attracting attention. The following Monday, whispers began spreading through the school. Teachers noticed Ethan's frequent visits. Parents started asking questions. Some smiled kindly. Others were far less generous. Claire overheard 2 parents talking outside the office. "Isn't that architect much younger than her? I heard he's only 28. What could he possibly see in a woman her age?" Claire froze. She wasn't meant to hear those words, but once spoken, they echoed endlessly. That evening, Claire drove home in silence. For the first time since meeting Ethan, she questioned everything. Maybe everyone else was right. Maybe she was being selfish. Maybe Ethan deserved someone younger, someone without emotional scars, someone who could give him a family without complications. The thoughts refused to leave. At dinner, Olivia noticed immediately. "Mom," Claire forced a smile. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." Claire continued eating. Olivia folded her arms. "You've barely spoken since you came home." After a long silence, Claire finally sighed. "Have you ever felt like people decide who you are before they even know you?" Olivia nodded. "Almost every day at school." Claire looked surprised. "Really? They think quiet people are weak. They think smart people are arrogant. They think different people are strange." She reached across the table. "You taught me something when I was little." Claire frowned. "I did?" Olivia smiled. "Never let someone else paint your portrait." Claire remembered saying those words years ago. She had forgotten they were meant for herself too. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan met his older brother Lucas for dinner. Lucas had always been protective. "So," Lucas said after a few minutes, "I heard you've been spending time with someone." Ethan smiled. "I have, serious? I think so." Lucas leaned forward. "Who is she?" Ethan answered proudly. Claire Bennett. Lucas searched his memory. The art teacher? Yes, I know her. Ethan smiled. She's incredible. Lucas hesitated. How old is she? Ethan calmly replied, 38. Silence. Lucas slowly placed his coffee cup on the table. Ethan, I already know what you're going to say. Do you? You're going to tell me I'm making a mistake. Lucas sighed. I'm telling you life will be harder. Ethan nodded. I know. People will judge. I know. You'll face criticism. I know. So why continue? Ethan smiled quietly. Because for the first time in my life, I've met someone who makes me feel completely understood. He looked out the restaurant window. I've dated women my own age. I've met beautiful people, successful people, interesting people. But Claire, he smiled to himself. She makes ordinary days feel meaningful. Lucas watched his younger brother carefully. For the first time, he realized this wasn't a passing attraction. It was love, real love. The next afternoon, Ethan visited the construction site. Claire was already there, reviewing the latest classroom layout. Neither of them mentioned the rumors. Instead, they walked through the unfinished halls together. Sunlight poured through the skeletal steel framework. Dust floated gently in the air like tiny stars. This room, Claire said, pointing ahead, will become the main painting studio. Ethan nodded. It'll be the brightest room in the building. Claire smiled. Every artist deserves light. They stood silently beside each other. Then Ethan spoke. Claire, she looked at him. I don't care what people say. Her expression changed. He continued gently. I know they're talking. I know they're judging. But none of that changes how I feel. Claire felt tears gathering in her eyes. Ethan, he stepped closer. I didn't choose you because of your age. I chose you because every time I'm with you, I become a better version of myself. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Claire wanted to believe him. Every part of her heart wanted to. But the voices of society were growing louder than the voice of love. And deep inside, fear had begun to win a battle she wasn't ready to fight. For the next several days, Claire did everything she could to avoid Ethan. If he called, she let the phone ring. If he stopped by the school, she asked another teacher to meet him. If they crossed paths in the hallway, she smiled politely and kept walking. To everyone else, nothing seemed unusual. But inside, Claire was fighting a battle that left her exhausted. She wasn't trying to protect herself. She was trying to protect Ethan. The more she cared for him, the more convinced she became that loving him meant letting him go. One rainy evening, Claire stood alone in her bedroom, staring at an old photograph. It showed her Michael and baby Olivia. She gently brushed away a layer of dust from the frame. I don't know what to do, she whispered. For years, she had believed staying loyal to Michael's memory meant never allowing herself to love again. But now, she realized something even more painful. She wasn't afraid of forgetting Michael. She was afraid of being happy again, because happiness could be taken away, just as it had been 12 years earlier. The following Saturday, Ethan sent a simple message. Can we meet? Just once. Please. Claire stared at the screen for almost an hour. Finally, she replied, tomorrow, Riverside Park. 5 o'clock. The next evening, gray clouds drifted across the sky as Ethan waited beside the lake. The park was almost empty. A cool breeze rippled across the water. Claire arrived wearing a light beige coat, her hands tucked into her pockets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan smiled softly. I'm glad you came. Claire nodded. I owe you that. They began walking slowly along the lakeside path. The silence between them felt heavier than any argument. Finally, Ethan stopped. Did I do something wrong? Claire looked down. No. Then why are you pushing me away? She took a deep breath. Because this can't work. Ethan frowned. Why? You already know why I don't. She finally looked into his eyes. I'm 10 years older than you. So, I have a teenage daughter, I know. I've already lived half my life. Ethan shook his head. No. You've lived 38 years. That's not the same thing. Claire's voice trembled. You deserve someone your own age. I deserve the person I love. She closed her eyes. You'll want children someday. Maybe you'll regret choosing me. I won't. You think that now. I know it. Claire felt tears filling her eyes. Ethan, he stepped closer. Tell me the truth. She remained silent. Do you love me? The question hung in the air. Claire couldn't answer, because if she spoke, everything she had built to protect herself would collapse. Ethan smiled sadly. I already know. Claire finally whispered the words she had rehearsed all night. I'm sorry. We have to end this. Ethan stared at her for several long seconds. He didn't move. Then he nodded once, not because he agreed, but because he loved her enough to respect her decision. If walking away is what you truly want, I won't stop you. Claire turned before he could see the tears running down her face. Every step away from him felt impossible. She wanted him to call her name. She wanted him to stop her. Instead, the only sound behind her was the wind moving across the lake. That night, Ethan returned to his apartment carrying the unopened gift he had planned to give Claire. Inside the small box was a silver necklace. The pendant was shaped like a tiny paintbrush. On the back were engraved 5 simple words: "Dream again, it's never too late." He placed the box inside his desk drawer, then quietly closed it. Weeks turned into months. Summer arrived. The new Creative Arts Center was nearly complete. Claire buried herself in work. She volunteered for extra classes. She stayed late after school. She convinced everyone, including herself, that she had made the right choice. But every corner of the building reminded her of Ethan: the wide eastern windows, the open studio spaces, the natural light. His fingerprints seemed to exist in every wall. Meanwhile, Ethan accepted a major architectural project in another city. He worked longer hours than ever before. His designs won awards. His company celebrated his success. Yet every achievement felt strangely empty. Late at night, he often found himself opening the drawer containing the small silver necklace. He never mailed it. He never threw it away. Some hopes are too precious to abandon. Olivia noticed the change in her mother. The laughter had disappeared. The spark in Claire's eyes had faded. One afternoon, while helping organize old papers in the living room, Olivia opened a small wooden box. Inside, she found photographs, construction sketches, coffee shop receipts, a pressed white lily, and a handwritten note. She unfolded it carefully. It was written in Ethan's neat handwriting. "Claire, you once told me that every painting begins with a blank canvas. I think life works the same way. No matter how much we've lost, there is always room to paint something beautiful again. You don't need to answer this letter. I only hope one day you believe you deserve happiness as much as everyone else." Olivia read the letter twice, then a third time. A tear rolled down her cheek. She finally understood. Ethan had never tried to change her mother. He had simply loved her, without conditions, without pressure, without asking her to become anyone else. That evening, Olivia looked at Claire across the dinner table. "Mom?" Claire smiled faintly. "Yes, are you happy?" The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. Claire lowered her eyes. After a long silence, she whispered the truth she had been hiding from everyone, including herself. "No." Quiet confession time lingered in the dining room long after the dishes had been cleared. Olivia looked at her mother with gentle eyes. "I've been waiting a long time for you to say that." Claire looked surprised. "You knew?" Olivia smiled sadly. "I've known for months." She reached into her backpack and carefully placed Ethan's letter on the table. Claire's face turned pale. "Where did you find this?" "In your memory box." Claire picked up the folded paper with trembling hands. "I forgot it was there." "No," Olivia replied softly. "I think you were trying not to remember." Claire looked down at the letter, tears beginning to blur the words. "I thought I was protecting him." Olivia shook her head. "Maybe you were protecting yourself." Those words struck Claire more deeply than any criticism she had heard from strangers. For years, she had blamed circumstances. She had blamed society. She had blamed her age. But the truth was much simpler. She had been afraid to trust happiness again. The next morning, Claire visited the cemetery where Michael was buried. She carried a small bouquet of white lilies, the same flowers Ethan had once brought to her classroom. The air was calm. Birds sang quietly from nearby trees. She stood before the headstone for several minutes without speaking. Finally, she smiled. "You always believed I was stronger than I thought." A gentle breeze moved through the grass. Claire took a slow breath. "I've spent 12 years trying to honor your memory." She paused. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to live." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I'm not leaving you behind. I'm carrying everything you gave me." She gently placed the flowers beside the stone. "And because of that, I think it's finally time to live again." For the first time in many years, she walked away from the cemetery without feeling guilty. Not because she loved Michael less, but because she finally understood that love doesn't disappear when the heart learns to love again. It simply grows. Meanwhile, Ethan was preparing for the grand opening of the Maplewood Creative Arts Center. Although his company had assigned another architect to oversee the final details, Ethan accepted one last invitation to attend the ceremony. He wasn't expecting anything. He simply wanted to see the students enjoy the building they had dreamed about together. The opening day arrived beneath a brilliant blue sky. The entire town gathered outside the new center. Students displayed paintings, local musicians performed, parents filled the courtyard with excited conversations. The once empty field had become a place overflowing with creativity. Claire stood backstage, looking through the curtains. Her heart raced. She searched the crowd, then she saw him, Ethan, standing quietly near the back, speaking with one of the construction managers. He looked exactly the same, yet somehow different, calmer, a little older, perhaps carrying the same invisible loneliness she had carried. Principal Margaret Lewis stepped beside Claire. "You've been looking in the same direction for 5 minutes." Claire smiled nervously. "I know." Margaret squeezed her shoulder. "Sometimes life gives us another chance." Claire nodded. "The question is, will we be brave enough to take it?" After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, visitors wandered through the building. Claire walked slowly toward the main painting studio. Sunlight poured through the eastern windows exactly as she had imagined years earlier. Students laughed while arranging their artwork. Then she heard familiar footsteps behind her. "You were right," she turned. Ethan stood in the doorway. "The morning light really does change the colors." Claire laughed softly through tears. "I told you." For a moment they simply looked at each other. No anger, no resentment. Only the quiet ache of two people who had loved deeply. Ethan smiled gently. "The building turned out beautifully." Claire shook her head. "It did because of you." He looked away. "It belongs to the students now." Claire took a slow step forward. "I owe you an apology." Ethan remained silent. "I hurt you, you did. I thought leaving was the right thing, I know. I was wrong." The words were barely above a whisper. "I wasn't protecting you, I was hiding." Ethan's eyes softened. "I never wanted you to be perfect. I only wanted you to be honest." Claire nodded. "I finally am." Just then, Olivia appeared at the doorway. She smiled knowingly. "I think you two need a few minutes." Before either of them could answer, she quietly walked away. Claire laughed. "She's wiser than I am." Ethan smiled. "I've always thought so." Silence returned, but this time, it felt hopeful. Claire reached into her handbag. Inside was the small wooden box Olivia had found. She opened it. "I believe this belongs to you." Ethan looked inside. The silver necklace was exactly where he had left it months ago. "I never had the courage to give it to you." Claire picked it up carefully. "May I see it?" He nodded. She turned the pendant over. The engraved words caught the sunlight. "Dream again. It's never too late." Claire closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the fear was gone. She looked directly into Ethan's eyes. "I love you." The words were simple, honest, free. "I should have said them a long time ago." Ethan smiled, his own eyes filled with tears. "I never stopped loving you." He gently fastened the necklace around her neck. "It suits you." Claire laughed softly. "No." She touched the tiny paintbrush pendant. "It reminds me who I used to be, and who you still are." Months later, the Creative Arts Center became one of the most beloved places in Maplewood. Students from across the county came to learn, create, and dream. Claire continued teaching. Ethan occasionally visited to mentor young designers. Olivia began preparing for art school. Encouraged by both of them, people still whispered from time to time. Some questioned the age difference. Others simply smiled. But for the first time, those opinions no longer mattered, because happiness was never something society could grant or take away. One autumn evening, Claire and Ethan sat on a wooden bench overlooking the lake where they had once said goodbye. The trees glowed with golden leaves. Claire rested her head gently on Ethan's shoulder. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd never met?" Ethan smiled. "No." "Why?" "Because some people don't enter our lives by accident. They arrive exactly when our hearts are finally ready to wake up." Claire intertwined her fingers with his. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon, painting the sky with shades of gold, orange, and violet. For years, Claire believed that love belonged only to the young. Now she understood something far more beautiful. Love does not ask how many birthdays you have celebrated. It asks only one question: do you still have the courage to open your heart? And this time, her answer was yes.